Hi, everyone, and welcome to week 3 of the summer course. I'm Professor Rios. I hope you're doing well. This week, the focus is entirely on Africa, all of it. So we begin with Chapter 6, Sub-Saharan Africa, anything south of the Sahara. And of course, we end with Southwest Asia and North Africa, which is basically the Sahara north towards the Mediterranean and the Arabian Peninsula. So let's begin with the Google Earth look. So we'll maximize the Google Earth window, and here you see Africa, the continent of it. It is, other than Eurasia, it is the biggest landmass on Earth. It can fit the United States, China, and Europe entirely within its borders. It is 2.65 times the size of the US. So that gives you a sense of how big Africa actually is. The US is really big, and yet Africa is 2+ times bigger than the US. It has within it one of the 3 tropical rainforests on Earth, the Congo. It has, of course, the biggest desert on Earth, the Sahara, which stretches 4,000 kilometers from west to east. It has the longest river on Earth, beginning in Tanzania and Kenya as the Blue and White Niles, which eventually merge in the city of Khartoum, Sudan, and becomes the Nile River, which then empties into the Mediterranean through Cairo in Egypt as the iconic Nile Delta. And there you see it before you. This region is unique in that when you think about Africa, people think of Africa as very sort of black in terms of the people that live there. And while that is certainly true in sub-Saharan Africa, when you think of Africa in the north part, Algeria, Libya, Egypt, Morocco, it's more Arab and it's more Persian in its background, as opposed to African, which is what you might think of when you think of places like the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Cameroon and Nigeria and places like that. So there's a lot of variety, there's a lot of diversity to Africa itself. It is comprised of many, many different physical landscapes. It is comprised of many, many different languages and religions. It has the absolute imprint of colonialism in its past, mostly French, but also British, Dutch, Portuguese, a little Spanish. So it's rather unique in its makeup. There's a couple of really good videos this week, one of which is the basis for your discussion. And it has to do with basically China's neo-colonialism inroads into Africa. Africa probably postured to become one of the centers of manufacturing on Earth, now that places like China and parts of Asia are becoming more and more developed and wealthier. Africa is also postured to become more wealthy as time progresses, but in terms of development, they sort of lag behind other places. So manufacturing and basically the cheap end of manufacturing is migrating towards the African continent. And China is an absolute big player in that game, if you want to think of it that way. From the perspective of the physical environment, so Africa is very north-south, as you can see, tropical climates, savanna climate on either side of that, deserts. So you have the Namibia Desert, Botswana, South Africa, the Kalahari. It has one of the most interesting features on Earth called the Okavango, which is this interior delta where all the water that falls during the wet season in Angola drains into this interior region. Now, if this were a wet climate, this would simply be a lake. But because it is not a wet climate, it is seasonal in its dryness and wetness. This area, the Okavango, is home to the planet's largest migration of animals ever on Earth. Animals know that the rains are coming. Animals know that the water is coming. So they've sort of tuned their migration patterns to coincide with when the waters arrive. And we're talking elephants, giraffe, wildebeest, monkeys and baboons, giraffe, rhinoceros, all kinds of animals. It's just an amazing, amazing migration scene that is not really seen anywhere like that on Earth. Of course, you have the Namibia Desert, and that's a function of cold ocean currents to its west, and also it's around 30 degrees latitude, so that basically also functions to promote some dryness. If you zoom out and you look at the island of Madagascar, one of the world's worst regions for deforestation. This is an area, you know, if you like vanilla, you know, vanilla bean is grown here. So agriculture is a significant part of it. And as a result, the island, which should look very dark green, like what you see here in this particular part of the image, looks brown because it's been deforested so intensely. Of course, when you look north and you have the desert, so you go from an area that's very lush and wet and green into an area that is seasonal, meaning it has a dry season and a wet season, and that's this right here. Also referred to as the Sahel, S-A-H-E-L. This is an ecotone, and an ecotone is an area of transition where you go from one environment to another. It doesn't just stop and end and something new starts. It slowly ends and something else slowly begins. And that's what you find in the Sahel, and then you're suddenly in the desert. So whether it be Chad or Niger or Mali or Mauritania, Algeria, Libya, Egypt, or northern Sudan, you're talking about vast stretches of emptiness. Not to forget Saudi Arabia and the Arabian Peninsula. You have Yemen, Oman, the United Arab Emirates, home to the city of Dubai, which has these amazing features and these islands that have been built over the years to extend the coastline of the region. So Dubai is a very wealthy area, and they've basically reinvented their entire landscape. Of course, you have Saudi Arabia, which is where the two biggest centers of Islam are found. We're talking about Medina, and we're talking about Mecca. So both of those places are of true significance to anybody who calls him or herself a Muslim. Of course, you have Israel and Jordan and Syria and Iraq. And in Israel, you have the two centers of Christianity, of course, and Judaism. And so very, very significant as you go from the new modern city of Tel Aviv, which is kind of an invented city with very little to no history whatsoever, to, of course, Jerusalem, which is so significant to so many people on earth, Muslims, Christians, Jews. Of course, you have the Dead Sea, and you have the Sea of Galilee as two very important water points along sort of the Israeli region. This is, of course, an area of seismic activity, and this is a fault line that goes right through Israel, between Israel and Jordan on either side. And that's basically your Google Earth, you know, sort of tour Again, you can look at this and examine it significantly and rather in detail if you want. One area that's, of course, that I should note before I get going will be the Horn of Africa, this region right here. Somalia, Djibouti, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Kenya. This area is very volatile. Somalia, along with Yemen, are two of the least developed places on Earth. So these are places with very little government input in a way. I mean, these are places that are in many parts lawless. So there's a lot of sort of clandestine activity that takes place, unfortunately. And Somalia is one of those weird places that sits very near the equator, yet isn't green. And that's because a lot of the moisture is basically falling in the form of rainfall in the mountains of Ethiopia to its west. So that right there is the Google Earth overview. Now let's look at each individual chapter. So let's look at basically chapter 6, Sub-Saharan Africa. Here's a great image of the Kilimanjaro mountain. It sits around 19,000 feet right at the equator. We're very close to the equator in the Kenya-Tanzania border. It is one of the most beautiful places on Earth. It's this ginormous mountain in the middle of an otherwise relatively flat area. So it's really kind of impossible to miss. Some of the learning objectives and key concepts. So again, we talked about the boundaries. The population of Sub-Saharan Africa is young, is fast growing, one of the only regions on Earth where this is happening. And it's very rural. So it's not basically based on cities yet. And there's the challenges that face the region. Again, the physical landscape, as mentioned, very complex. From its river systems to the fact that it has this rather significant scarp along its terrain called the Rift Valley. Again, if you were to fit the United States, China, India, Japan, Europe, inside Africa, you could. It is a very, very big place. So just to give you a sense of its size. You could fit the island of Greenland inside of Africa 13 times. So it is a very, very large geographical place. It is very young. This is the percentage of population under the age of 15. Notice how in Africa, with very few exceptions, everybody sort of fits in this dark color here. That 42 to 50% of the population is under 15 years of age. Subsistence agriculture is still a big deal, and that is the agriculture that you perform in order to basically just feed yourself. And in Africa, an interesting fact is that greater than 50% of all farmers are female. That's very different than European-based countries, than the United States or Canada, or even in Latin America for that matter. Here's an example as to how much of a percentage of gross domestic product agriculture is a part of. And this is a dated image from 2006, but it still applies. The fact that in a lot of sub-Saharan countries, agriculture comprises a significant percentage of their total economy. Talked about the Okavango, again, that interior delta system. It's unique in the entire world. It is, again, a seasonal ecosystem, this little chicken leg looking thing right here, and this is how it's seen from space. Notice how the water is shining with the sun above it. So this is all the water flowing down from the mountains of Angola. Again, There's a strong seasonality in most of sub-Saharan Africa with a distinctive rainfall peak and a distinctive rainfall lull, as you can see by the little peaks in the precipitation graphs. And most of the climates are either A or B, with very few exceptions in far southern Africa, where you actually find some mild mid-latitude climates, but you have to go all the way to the very, very, very end of South Africa in order to find those. Again, some of the biomes that you find, of course, all wet tropical rainforests. You find savannas, which are dry wet. So there's a dry period and a wet period. And you can see that by the vegetation. Notice how it's not entirely, it doesn't look like this. It looks like this. It's a little scrubbier. And of course you have deserts. Again, some of the environmental issues. The biggest one, of course, is water, or lack of water or access to water, but also deforestation. And in some places, deforestation is being addressed, and many other places, deforestation is not being addressed. And so one of the weird things about tropical rainforests is if you tear down a tropical rainforest strand, it doesn't come back right away like you think it would. It's a little bit counterintuitive. Soils in tropical regions are actually relatively poor, and that's because everything grows so fast and decomposes so fast, and it's always so wet, that the nutrients are often found at the very, very top. And if you deforest it, then all the water washes it away, and you're left with this very crappy layer of relatively poor soil. So it doesn't quite come back. It takes a long time for a tropical rainforest to sort of reassert itself. Okay. The Sahel, here's that region. Notice it's that blue section right there. It is an ecotone, as mentioned earlier. It's a zone that lies between the Sahara Desert to the north and the very wet savanna to its south. Okay, it's characterized by a long, dry season and a very short, wet season. And if that wet season happens not to come, you have to wait another dry season to get to the next year before you actually experience rain. Here's the only rain or river system in the region. It's called the Niger. And it flows basically from the wetlands of upland Guinea through the desert back into a wet area before it empties into the Atlantic Ocean. And as a result of that seasonality, notice how the precipitation is in the southern hemisphere in March, and it moves with the sun and the season in September. And the same thing goes for vegetation. In the northern hemisphere, in March, the vegetation is south of the equator mostly, and that vegetation, by the time September rolls along, has moved north. It literally moves with the sun. As the sun's rays, direct rays, move further north into the northern hemisphere, so does the rainfall. Here's a look at the physical setting of the Sahel. It has many contrasts and challenges, lots of states, people, inhabitants. It's expected to grow. It's expected to double in population by 2050. It has, as mentioned, a seasonal climate and lots of food, border, water security concerns to deal with. Some of the cultural settings, of course, you're talking about the intersection of religions, colonial boundaries, young populations. And as a result, you have an area that is more vulnerable than other regions to things like desertification, climate change, and so on. Here's a way of looking at that region in terms of climate change. And this is a little conceptual model that I came up with. There's nothing mathematical about this, it's just conceptual. But think of climate change as sort of the baseline problem, right? I know there's many other problems, but think of this one as a big baseline problem. It can lead to human security issues, forced migration, border issues. And those can lead to things like climate refugees and terror actors. It can lead to economic insecurity, the reliance or over-reliance on things like Doctors Without Borders and the UN and UNICEF, health, disease, vectors, food security, and water security, right? So these are all connected to one another in some way. So there's, human security can lead to economic insecurity. Water security can lead to human security. Human security can compound food, health, and economy. Get it? It's all connected. And it's almost like the unraveling of a system. When one thing goes bad, other things can go bad in response. And that's the idea of the thinking of the world as a connected system. There's a video online about the fighting of desertification in the Sahel. This is found in the class YouTube playlist. And there's other ones here regarding the Green Belt Project and the larger scale Green Belt Project that the whole continent of Africa is sort of engaging. Again, I highly recommend both of them. They're not very long. Here's the idea of deforestation, and deforestation is significant because when you deforest tropical rain regions, tropical rainforest regions, it's still going to rain a lot, and now there's nothing to hold the soil back. So what you get is this. Notice how this image looks like the island of Madagascar is bleeding. And what is it bleeding? It's bleeding soil. And soil takes a long time to form. So this image on the lower part of the screen should be a tropical rainforest. But because it's been deforested so heavily, it doesn't. It looks like a desert, actually. And notice the color of the water. It's a river flowing right through here. Notice how it's all brown. That means it's choked with sediment. Again, some of the vulnerability risks. The idea of food and food insecurity. And climate is a significant aspect and part of this. Of course, population. We talked about the fact that population is significant here because this is one area that is actually growing quickly compared to other parts of the world where the opposite is taking place. So this is unique in the world. The one area of the world where population, even though it may be starting to slow down, is still really, really fast growing compared to everybody else. So here's a place like Somalia or Niger, or comparing Botswana in 2018 to Botswana in 2050, and the interrupted nature of that as a function of HIV/AIDS. And here are some of the fertility rates. Notice, on average, they're declining, but still very high compared to almost every other area of the world. And that's a big deal. Remember, total fertility rate. That is the average number of kids born to a woman during her reproductive years. Okay? Here's the idea of the global birth rate. Notice where they tend to be highest. And the death rate. Now, death rate is a little bit different because death rate really has, like in the United States, our death rate is about to go up a lot. It has nothing to do with the fact that we're getting unhealthy, but it has to do with the fact that we're just getting old. There's going to be more old people than young people in the US. The same thing applies to Europe. So death rate is not necessarily the same indicator as birth rate. Birth rate is clearly higher in areas of lesser development. And again, one of the most significant statistics that implies development or lack of development is birth rate. It's just the way that is. So the higher your fertility rate, the lower your development tends to be. Here's an example of the single biggest discrepancy between more developed and developing regions of the world. Notice this is maternal deaths per 1,000 live births. So basically, if you live in the developed world, say the United States, Canada, Europe, and if you're a pregnant woman, chances are anything that could potentially kill you during pregnancy can be addressed. But in parts of the world that are not developed, you may not be able to have access to that hospital who might be able to run that very specific test to let you know something is not quite right. Okay? So I always use the example of a friend of mine whose baby was going to be born with her head already fused inside womb, meaning that child was not going to be born the way normal kids are born. When you're born, your head is still very malleable. It allows the baby to basically move through the birth canal without getting too graphic. Well, my friend's baby's head was already fused in utero. Therefore, had that baby been allowed to come to term without assistance, my friend would have died during birth. So, because they knew that through a very basic blood test, they basically did a C-section on my friend. And now the baby is a fine 25-year-old woman. So that's I think a really, really amazing example of this. So here's the idea of maternal mortality in the world. Again, notice where maternal mortality is highest versus where it is lowest. So that's this presentation, this part of it that I wanted to show you. I want to move on to Southwest Asia and North Africa. The image you see here is the outline or the skyline of the city of Dubai and the United Arab Emirates. Objectives and terms. Again, where it stretches from, there's what it looks like. It's actually a little bit more tectonically active. You have a fault line through the Red Sea. The Red Sea is actually getting bigger. Fault line through Iraq and the Persian Gulf. Right through here in Syria, Jordan, Israel, where you have the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee. So this region here is also splitting, getting larger over time. And of course, through the Mediterranean in Turkey, okay? So I always like to think of Turkey, before we get going, as a bridge. Think of it as a land bridge. And it's a bridge that perfectly connects the Middle East and more Muslim world to Europe and more Christian world. And that's a very interesting aspect of Turkey. The further east you go, the more Muslim it is. The further west you go, the more Western it feels and looks. Doesn't mean that there are not Islam influences. Of course there are, but it's a very, very different country as you travel east-west along this rather rectangular looking country, which again connects both Europe and the Middle East. Here's a good example of development. This is one of those islands that I showed you on that Google Earth tour. Again, Palm Jumeirah, and in fact, maybe it's worth going over to Google Earth again to show you that. Let's see here. That would be this palm, looking at it from space, right? That would be this image right there. And so it's beautiful, lots of development. This is invented space. There's a hotel just like in the Bahamas. It's called the Atlantis, but it's the Atlantis Dubai. Water parks, hotels, golf courses, you know, your typical luxury hotel. These are individual homes that people own. You have your own, everybody has their own beach. And so this is what Dubai has done in order to extend its geography beyond its normal coastline. Okay, this is what Dubai looks like now, what it looked like in the early 90s. And the reason for all this change is they understand that they're running out of oil and that they need to reinvent their economy. So they've decided to become a tourist destination, a banking center. They've decided to become the Las Vegas, the Monaco, the Grand Cayman Islands of the region. And very smart, very well done. Some of the best architecture on earth is taking place here. It has the world's tallest building. And so that's one area. Other parts have instability, and the whole ISIS thing has somewhat slowed down from what it was, but they're not completely gone. And it's an area that really affects Syria and Iraq. And so this area is super complicated. And here's, for example, the idea of the multicultural aspect in parts of Iraq. The fact that there's Sunni, Shia, and Kurds. And so you have Iraq, which is a set of borders imposed by the British, a term called superimposed borders, meaning a border that you put into place with no regard for the culture there. And you have to think of it, and again, for an American kid, for an American period, this is hard to understand. In the United States, and again, if you're not an American listening to this, just pay close attention. If you're an American, you know that in the US, we strive for diversity, and we have people who are black and white and Hispanic and Asian and Christian and Muslim and Jewish and Buddhist and whatever, right? In some parts of the world, that's not really what they want. And that's not meant to be a disparaging remark. It's just simply the way it is. In many parts of the world, they'd rather be with their own kind. And again, I'm not trying to say that in a negative sense. It's just the way it is. So when you put borders that put people of different backgrounds and religions inside the same country, it can sometimes lead to trouble. So for example, Kurds are found in Syria and in Turkey and in northern Iraq and in Iran, in parts of Azerbaijan, in Armenia, in Georgia. So that's problematic. If, for example, the government of those countries don't really account for the fact that there are people of varying backgrounds. It's a problem in many parts of the world, not just the Middle East. So it can lead to instability. Of course, you have the area of migration, what happened in 2011 and beyond. And of course, it just didn't stem from Syria, but it also stemmed from parts of Africa, Libya, and Sudan, and Mali, and basically the move north into Italy, And then from Italy to places like France and the United Kingdom and Germany and Sweden. So these are forced migration flows. Of course, oil, the oil market, OPEC, the oil market has basically taken a beating. And while that may be good for you as a consumer of gasoline, because gas prices are low at the moment, it basically has had a devastating impact on oil markets and oil-based economies. Now, some people say, well, maybe that's a good opportunity to move to more renewable sources of energy. True, I agree. But there's still a negative impact and there's a negative economic consequence to that. So there's a lot of current infighting between Russia and Saudi Arabia, which has led to oil prices being at record lows, basically. And the idea of globalization and oil, we talked about globalization, right? Everything in the world is globalized. COVID-19 was a globalized commodity in essence. It's gone global, right? Pandemic. That is what the word means. I don't know if you ever stop to think about the word pandemic. An epidemic is an outbreak of a disease locally. A pandemic is a global epidemic. Pan, P-A-N. Pan American Games, all the Americas. Pandemic, epidemic everywhere. So in case you didn't know what the actual term meant. But oil is something that we tend to go far to get. Most of it comes from the Middle East, but some of it comes from Canada. Some of it comes from South America. Some of it comes from the Gulf of Mexico, okay? And it takes really, really long trips to get to where it's needed. Some of the environmental issues. Desertification is the big one in this region, and water access. So managing water is a big deal, whether it be water, fossil water, which is water that's underground in places like Israel, the West Bank, and that very, very touchy subject of land in what we call Israel, the West Bank, Palestine, that whole region. Desalination. Now, desalination is expensive. It's energy intensive. And it usually returns a lot of salt. And by the way, remember the palm? There it is. This is the palm. And here's a desalination plant right by it. It's a really good video on how to desalinize water and what it takes and what happens when you convert billions of gallons of seawater into drinking water. It can be sustainably done, but it is still very expensive. So if it weren't, you could simply set up desalination plants all across the earth and there would never be water issues. But it isn't quite that way just yet, maybe in the future. Again, the importance of water, you have the Suez Canal. And the Suez Canal, by the way, would be, let's see. Right here. There it is. A man-made structure. In fact, if you zoom in, you can actually see the trail of a ship. There it is. There's a barge going, probably an oil tanker going right through it. And the beauty of the Suez Canal is it allows you to shortcut having to go all the way around Africa. It can save a company 10,000 miles of travel. That's a lot of time and a lot of money. And so this Suez Canal can allow a company to go from an oil location here in Saudi Arabia right to Europe, rather than having to do this huge trip across the Atlantic and the Pacific, I'm sorry, the Indian Ocean and then the Atlantic Ocean. Okay. Again, the climate, aridity, B climates for the most part, except for the northern edge, Turkey, and the higher plains and the higher plateaus of Turkey and northern Iran. Population is unevenly distributed, no big surprise, very few population settlements in the desert. And again, it's an area that has development and developing areas within it. So you have some places colored in the green of really high fertility. So places like the Gaza, Iraq, Jordan, Sudan, and Yemen. And yet you have other areas like the UAE and Lebanon and Iran where fertility is very, very low, okay? And here's an example, Morocco. It was 2.7 in 2014 and 2.1 in 2017. So it has basically begun to slow significantly. And you can see that in the way the shape looks. It was growing, 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 growing. Suddenly, it's sort of pared down. Here's Turkey, Iran. Here's a very significant generational shift. Iran went from a stage 2 country, say about 40 years ago, to suddenly a stage 4 country very, very quickly. There's a generational shift right there about 30 years ago. So the usage of contraception became more widely available. Here's an example of Iraq in 2017, still fast growing, still stage 2 of demographic, probably beginning to slow down in its population shape, starting to anyway. Here's an example of an interrupted area, Kuwait or the UAE, where they borrow a lot of male workers, and it generates an imbalance in the gender structure. And they borrow primarily from Bangladesh, India, and Sri Lanka. So these are seasonal workers. They work in anything from construction to the hospitality industry to really any other thing that the local population, frankly, does not want to do. And as a result, you get this unnatural looking population. There's Saudi Arabia. Again, here's where the majority of those workers come from. So this is where I'll leave it for the lesson. Again, I highly recommend you watch both, but maybe you can watch them in installments. And again, a very interesting region. Africa is a lot more diverse than people give it credit for. It is a lot bigger than people realize. And it plays, and it's going to be playing a more significant role in the world stage as the 20th century moves towards its halfway point. Again, if you have any questions, please let me know. Always the live office hour is on Wednesday, so if you have any questions, feel free to come to that or just mail me a question if you do have one. Otherwise, I hope you have a fantastic week and best of luck. Bye.